Hi everybody. I'm going to try recording myself today, and so we're going to see how this works. But hello to Bella and Seth and Daniel and Caleb and Kyle and anyone else who's out there watching whose name I've forgotten. How about Arlo and Ainsley, and who else do I know? I forget. But today we're going to read McBroom Tells the Truth by Sid Fleshman and illustrated by Kurt Worth. This was actually a book given to my big brother Scott. I have no idea how I got it. There's Mr. McBroom, and there's his terrible neighbor. We'll find out all about him. All right. There has been so much tomfool nonsense told about McBroom's wonderful 1-acre farm that I had better set matters straight. I'm McBroom, Josh McBroom. I'll explain about the watermelons in a minute. I aim to put down the facts, one after the other, the way things happened exactly. It began, you might say, the day we left the farm in Connecticut. We piled our youngsters and everything we owned in our old air-cooled Franklin automobile and headed west. To count noses, in addition to my own, there was my dear wife, Melissa, and our 11 red-headed youngsters. Their names were Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clarinda. It was summer, and the trees along the way were full of birdsong. We had got as far as Iowa when my dear wife made a startling discovery. We had 12 children along. One too many. She had just counted them again. I slammed on the brakes and raised a cloud of dust. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clarinda, I shouted, line up! The youngsters tumbled out of the car, and I counted noses, and there were 12. I counted again. 12. It was a baffler, as all the faces were familiar. Once more I made the count, but this time I caught Larry slipping around behind. He was having his nose counted twice, and the mystery was solved, the little scamp. We didn't laugh, though, and stretch our legs in the bargain. Just then, a thin, long-legged man came ambling down the road. He was so scrawny, I do believe he could have hidden behind a flagpole, ears and all. He wore a tall, stiff collar and a diamond stick pin in his tie, and a straw hat. "Laws, neighbor," he asked, spitting out the pips of a green apple he was eating. "Not a bit," I said. "We're heading west, sir. We gave up our farm. It was half rocks and the other half tree stumps. Folks tell us there's land out west, and the sun shines in the winter." The stranger pursed his lips. "Well, you can't beat Iowa for farmland." "Maybe so," I nodded, "but I'm short of funds. Unless they're giving farms away in Iowa, we'll keep going." So the man scratched his chin. "Well, see here. I've got more land than I can plow. You look like nice folks. I'd like to have you for neighbors. I'll let you have 80 acres cheap. Not a stone or a tree stump anywhere on the place. Make an offer." "Well, thank you kindly, sir," I smiled, "but I'm afraid you would laugh at me if I offered you everything in my leather purse." "Well, how much is that?" $10 exactly." "Sold," he said. Well, I almost choked with surprise. I thought he must be joking. But quick as a flea, he was scratching out a deed on the back of an old envelope. "Hector Jones is my name," he said. "Name, neighbor," he said. "You can call me Heck. Everyone does." Was there ever a more kindly and generous man? He signed the deed with a flourish, and I gladly opened the clasp of my purse. 3 milky white moths flew out. They had been gnawing on the $10 bill all the way from Connecticut. but enough remained to buy the farm, and not a stone or a tree stump on it. Mr. Heck Jones jumped on the running board and guided us a mile up the road. My youngsters tried to amuse him along the way. Will wiggled his ears, and Jill crossed her eyes, and Chester twitched his nose like a bunny rabbit. But I reckon Mr. Jones wasn't used to youngsters. Hester flapped her arms like a bird, and Peter whistled through his front teeth, which were missing. And Tom tried to stand on his head in the back of the car. Mr. Heck Jones just ignored them all. Finally, he raised his long arm and pointed. "There's your property, neighbor," he said. Well, didn't we tumble out of the car in a hurry. We gazed with delight at our new farm. It was broad and sunny, with an oak tree on a gentle hill. There was one defect, to be sure. A boggy-looking pond spread across an acre beside the road. You could lose a cow in a place like that, but we had got a bargain, no doubt about it. "Mama," I said to my dear Melissa, "see that fine old oak on the hill? That's where we'll build our farmhouse." "Well, no, you won't," said Mr. Heck Jones. "That oak ain't on your property." "But, sir," let me show you the picture. "But, sir, all that's yours is what you see under the water, not a rock or a tree stump in it, like I said." I thought he must be having his little joke, except there wasn't a smile to be found on his face. "But, sir," I said, "you clearly stated that the farm was 80 acres. "That's right. That marshy pond there hardly covers an acre." "That's wrong," he said. "There are a full 80 acres, one piled on top of the other, like griddle cakes. I didn't say your farm was all on the surface. It's 80 acres deep, McBroom. Read the deed." I read the deed, and it was true. "Hee-haw, hee-haw," he snorted. "I got the best of you, McBroom. Good day, neighbor." And he scurried away, laughing up his sleeve all the way home. I soon learned that Heck was always laughing up his sleeves. Folks told me that when he hung up his coat to go to bed, all that stored up laughter would pour out his sleeve and keep him awake at nights. But there's no truth to that. I'll tell you about the watermelons in a minute. Well, there we stood, gazing at our 1-acre farm that wasn't good for anything but jumping into on a hot day, and that day was the hottest I could remember. The hottest on record, as it turned out. That was the day, 3 minutes before noon, when the cornfields all over Iowa exploded into popcorn. Now that's history. You must have read about it. There's pictures to prove it. I turned to our children. "Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tommy, Mary, Larry, and little Clarinda," I said. "There's always a bright side to things. That pond we bought is a mite muddy, but it's wet. Let's jump in and cool off." Well, that idea met with favor, and we were soon in our swimming togs, and I gave the signal, and we took off running jump. At that moment, a dry spell struck that we landed in an acre of dry earth. That pond had evaporated. It was very surprising. My boys had jumped in head first, and there was nothing to be seen of them but their legs kicking in the air. I had to pluck them out of the earth like carrots. Some of my girls were still holding their noses. Of course, they were sorely disappointed to have that swimming hole pulled out from under them. But the moment I ran the topsoil through my fingers, my farmer's heart skipped a beat. That pond bottom felt soft and as rich as black silk. "My dear Melissa," I called, "come look. This topsoil's so rich it ought to be kept in the bank." And I was in a sudden fever of excitement. That glorious topsoil seemed to cry out for seed. My dear Melissa had a sack of dried beans along, and I sent Will and Chester to fetch it. I saw no need to bother plowing the field. I directed Polly to draw a straight furrow with a stick and Tim to follow along behind her, poking holes in the ground. Then I came along and dropped a bean in each hole and stamped on it with my heel. Well, I'd hardly gone a couple of yards when something green and leafy tangled my foot. I looked behind me, and there was a beanstalk traveling along, a hurry looking for a pole to climb. Glory be, I explained, the soil was rich. The stalks were spreading out all over. I had to rush to keep ahead of them. By the time I got to the end of the furrow, the first stalks had blossomed and the pods were formed and they were ready for picking. You could imagine our excitement. Will's ears wiggled, Jill's eyes crossed, Chester's nose twitched, Hester's arms flapped, Peter's missing front teeth whistled, and Tom stood on his head. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tommy, Mary, Larry, and little Clary and I shouted, "Harvest them beans!" And within an hour we had planted and harvested that entire crop of beans. But it was hot working in the sun. I sent Larry to find a good acorn along the road, and we planted it, but it didn't grow near as fast as I had expected. We had to wait an entire 3 hours for a shade tree. Well, we made camp under our oak tree, and the next day we drove to Barnesville with our crop of beans. I traded it for various seeds, carrots and beets and cabbage and other items. The storekeeper found a few kernels of corn that hadn't popped at the very bottom of his bin. But we found out that corn was positively dangerous to plant. The stalks shot up so fast it would skin our nose. Of course, there was a secret to that topsoil. A government man came out and made a study of the matter. He said that there had once been a huge lake in that part of Iowa. It had taken thousands of years to shrink up to our pond, as you can imagine. The lake fish must have packed in worse than sardines. There's nothing like fish to put nitrogen in the soil. And that is a scientific fact. Nitrogen makes things grow best of all. Nitrogen makes things grow to beat all, and we did occasionally turn up a fishbone. Well, it wasn't long before Heck Jones came around to pay us a neighborly call. He was eating a raw turnip, and when he saw the way we were planting and harvesting cabbage, his eyes popped out of his head and almost cost him his eyesight. He scurried away, muttering to himself. "My dear Melissa," I said, "that man is up to some mischief." Folks in town had told me that Mr. Heck Jones had the worst farmland in Iowa. He couldn't give it away. Tornado winds had carried off his topsoil and left hardpan right on top. He had to plow it with wedges and a sledgehammer. One day we heard a lot of booming on the other side of the hill, and my youngsters went up to see what was happening, and it turned out he was planting seeds with a shotgun. Meanwhile, we went about our business on the farm. I don't mind saying that before long we were showing a handsome profit. Back in Connecticut, we had been lucky to harvest one crop a year. Now we were planting and harvesting 3-4 crops a day. But there were things we had to be careful about. Weeds, for one thing. My youngsters took turns standing weed guard. The instant a weed popped out of the ground, they had to race to it and hoe it to death. You can imagine what would happen if weeds ever got in a rich soil like ours. We also had to be careful about planting time. Once we planted lettuce just before my dear Melissa rang the noon bell for dinner. While we ate, the lettuce headed up and went to seed, and we lost the whole crop. One day, back came Mr. Heck Jones with a grin on his face. He had figured out a loophole to the deed he had made for our farm. He laughed. He was munching a radish. "I got the best of you now, neighbor McBroom. The deed says you were to pay me everything in your purse, and you didn't." "On the contrary," I answered, $10. There wasn't another cent in my purse." "There were maws in your purse. I seen them flutter out. 3 milky white maws, McBroom. I want 3 maws by 3 o'clock this afternoon, or I aim to take back the farm. Hee-haw. And off he went, laughing up his sleeve. Mama was just ringing the noon bell, so we didn't have much time, confound the man. But he did have his legal point. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clarinda, I said. We've got to catch 3 milky white maws in a hurry. We hurried in all directions, but maws are next to impossible to locate in the daytime. Try it yourself. Each of us came back empty-handed. My dear Melissa began to cry. For sure we were going to lose our farm. I don't mind telling you that things looked dark, very dark. And that was it. I sent the youngsters running down the road to a lonely old pine tree and told them to rush back with a bushel of pine cones. Didn't we get busy, though? We planted a pine cone every 3 feet, and they began to grow. We stood around anxiously, and I kept looking at my pocket watch. I'll tell you about the watermelons in a minute, though. Sure enough, by 10 minutes to 3, those cones had grown into a thick pine forest, and it was dark inside, too. Not a ray of sunlight slipped between the green pine boughs. Deep in the forest, I lit a lantern. Hardly a minute had passed before I was surrounded by milky white moths. They thought it was night. I caught 3 on the wing and rushed out of the forest. And there stood Mr. Heck Jones, waiting with the sheriff to foreclose. Hee-haw, hee-haw, old Heck laughed. He was eating a quince apple. It's nigh on to 3 o'clock, and you can't catch maws in the daytime. The farm is mine. Not so fast, Neighbor Jones, I said, my hands cupped together. Here are the 3 maws. Now skedaddle, sir, before your feet take root and poison ivy grows out your ears. He scurried away, muttering to himself. My dear Melissa, I said, that man is up to mischief. He'll be back. We took a good bit of work to clear the timber, I'll tell you. We had some of the pine milled and built ourselves a house on the corner of the farm. What was left we gave away to our neighbors. We were weeks blasting the roots out of the ground. But I don't want you to think there was nothing but work on our farm. Some crops we grew just for the fun of it. Take pumpkins. The vines grew so fast that we could hardly catch those pumpkins. It was something to see. The youngsters used to wear themselves out running after those pumpkins. Sometimes they'd have pumpkin races. Sunday afternoon, just for the sport of it, the older boys would plant pumpkin seeds and try to catch a ride. It wasn't easy. You had to grab hold the instant the blossom dropped off and the pumpkins began to swell. Whoosh! It would yank you off your feet and take you whizzing over the farm until it wore itself out. Sometimes they'd use banana squash, which was faster. And the girls learned to ride corn stalks like pogo sticks. It was just a matter of standing over the kernel as the stalk came bursting up through the ground. It was good for quite a bounce. We'd see Mr. Heck Jones standing on the hill in the distance watching. He wasn't going to rest until he had pried us off our land. Then, late one night, I was awakened by a hee-hawing outside the house. I went to the window and saw old Heck in the moonlight. He was cackling and chuckling and heeing and hawing and sprinkling seed every which way. I pulled off my sleeping cap and rushed outside. What mischief are you up to, Neighbor Jones? I shouted. Hee-haw, he answered and scurried away, laughing up his sleeve. Well, I had a sleepless night, as you can imagine. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, the farm of ours broke into weeds. You never saw such weeds. They heaved out of the ground and tumbled madly over each other, chickweed and milkweed, thistles and wild morning glory. In no time at all, the weeds were in a tangle several feet thick and still rising. We had a fight on our hands, I tell you. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tommy, Mary, Larry, and little Clarinda, I shouted. There's work to do. and we started hoeing and hacking, and for every weed we uprooted, another reseeded itself. There was a solid month battling those weeds. If our neighbors hadn't pitched in to help, we'd still be there burning weeds. The day finally came when the farm was cleared and up popped old Heck Jones. He was eating a big slice of watermelon, and that's what I was going to tell you about. "Howdy, neighbor McBroom," he said. "I came to say goodbye." "Are you leaving, sir?" I asked. "No, but you are." I looked him squarely in the eye. "And if I don't, sir?" "Why, hee-haw, McBroom, there's heaps more weed seeds where that came from." My dander was up. I rolled back my sleeves, meaning to give him a whipping he wouldn't forget. But what happened next saved me the bother. As my youngsters gathered round, Mr. Heck Jones made the mistake of spitting out a mouthful of watermelon seeds. Things did happen fast. Before I had quite realized what he had done, the watermelon vine was whipping around old Heck's scrawny legs and jerked him off his feet. He went whizzing every which way all over the farm. The watermelon seeds were flying. Soon he came zipping back and collided with a pumpkin left over from Sunday. In no time, watermelons and pumpkins went galloping all over the place, and they were knocking him about something wild. He streaked here and there, melons crushed and exploded. Old Heck was soon covered in watermelon pulp, and he looked like he had been shot out of a ketchup bottle. It was something to see. Will stood there wiggling his ears. Jill crossed her eyes. Chester twitched his nose, and Hester flapped her arms like a bird. Peter whistled through his front teeth, which had grown in. Tom stood on his head, and little Clarinda took her first step. By then, the watermelons and pumpkins began to play themselves out. I figure Mr. Heck Jones would like to get home as fast as possible, so I asked Larry to fetch me the seed of a large banana squash. "Hee-haw, neighbor Jones," I said, and I pitched the seeds at his feet. I hardly had time to say goodbye before the vine had hit him. A long banana squash gave him fast ride all the way home. I wish I could have been there to see it. He never came back. That's the entire truth of the matter, and anything else you hear about McBroom's wonderful one-acre farm is an outright fib. The end. That was a long one.